Tied to a stake, Samuel looked up into the terrifying visage of the great predator before him. It was taller than any of the houses in the village and could easily swat him like a fly. He closed his eyes and turned away, hoping that whatever happened would be quick. A moment later, the ground shook, but when nothing else happened, Samuel cracked his eyes open and spared a glance. The dragon was now leaning forward, resting its chin in its great clawed hands as it braced its elbows on the ground, bringing the beast's head almost down to Samuel's eye level. Almost. It was such an odd, human-like posture that, for a moment, Samuel forgot his fear and stared blankly at the dragon. Then the beast spoke. "Little human, what are you doing here?" The dragon's words were powerful, almost overwhelming. He felt his entire body vibrate with the reverberations of those words. Samuel could only stammer in answer. "You speak?" "Well, of course you speak. Obviously. I mean, you're speaking to me right now, but I didn't expect." The dragon cut him off once again. "Yes, I possess some mastery over the words of man, slow and inefficient as they may be. But that does not answer my question. Human. Why are you here, in front of my home?" Samuel looked behind the dragon into the massive cavern from which it had crawled. It had called that its home. Not its cavern or lair, its home. Then, realizing he probably shouldn't make the dragon ask its question a third time, he stammered out his answer. Well, I'm here to. That is to say, I'm supposed to. I was chosen to. Appease you. How does one address a dragon? Great dragon. The dragon raised one of its massive eye ridges. Are you asking me? Samuel shook his head, his embarrassment momentarily warring with his terror. No. I just wasn't sure how to address you, is all. The dragon turned its head and shook, a plume of flame escaping its mouth as it did so. After a moment, Samuel realized it was laughing, or at least chuckling, before it turned back to him and spoke again. You cannot pronounce my name in your tongue, and there's no reason for you to be so familiar with me either, given the brevity of our acquaintance. For now, you may call me Dragon. Drop the grate. Now, how exactly will you appease me, little human? Are you some great scholar of your people, able to offer me hours of intellectual discussion? Are you a great craftsman here to adorn my home with works of art? Or perhaps you're a great noble, offering up your riches untold? Samuel felt his face grow hot as he realized he could offer none of those things. Well, I am an apprentice woodworker. I could make you a serviceable table or chairs or something of the sort, though I don't know how I'd begin crafting for your, scale. The dragon turned its head and chuckled again before responding. And is that how you are supposed to appease me? By crafting me some tables and chairs? Samuel hung his head and mumbled an answer. I think I was left here to be eaten. The dragon leaned in a little closer, and Samuel could feel the heat of its breath as it spoke. I'm sorry. What was that? You're too small and quiet. You'll have to speak up. What the hell? It's not like he had anything to lose at this point. Raising his head, Samuel looked the dragon in the eye and stated more loudly, They expect you to eat me. Samuel had been expecting a lot of things, from being cooked by fire breath to being eaten in one gulp. But when the dragon rolled over onto its side, snorting flames as it laughed heartily, all he could do was stare dumbfounded. The laughter went on long enough that he started to get annoyed. It's not that funny. Not from where I'm, not standing exactly, but... The dragon rolled back onto its stomach and shook its long, sinewy neck as it got its laughter under control. No, I suppose it wouldn't be all that funny to you, would it? But tell me, how is a small piece of meat like you supposed to satiate me? You're barely a mouthful. When I'm hungry, I can eat several buffalo. A tiny thing like you would scarcely suit me as an appetizer. The dragon shook its head, shaking away the last of the laughter, and leaned in close. So tell me, tiny human, what did you do to earn yourself a place on my front step? Did you lie, cheat, and steal? Maybe you murdered someone. Or perhaps you shirked your duties and refused to work. Samuel shook his head. No. Nothing like that. I just lost the… lottery is all. The dragon leaned in again, giving Samuel a much closer impression of the differences in their sizes. It hadn't been exaggerating when it said it would have gobbled him down with one bite. You lost the lottery? His mouth suddenly dry, Samuel nodded. Yeah. They held a drawing and the loser got sent here. That's me. The dragon looked thoughtful as it mused more to itself than Samuel. Well, I suppose it's at least a fair method to determine who got tied to a stake in front of my den. Everyone had an equal chance after all. Samuel smirked and shook his head. Well, not quite. That got the dragon's attention again as it turned back to Samuel. Oh! I take it there was more to it than that? Samuel nodded. Yeah. Anyone deemed essential was spared from the drawing. Some of them, like old William, made sense. He's the town healer, and the village would be in trouble without him. However, for some reason, anyone with enough money was deemed essential. That included their entire families in most cases. Somehow, the dragon's scaly mouth managed to stretch out into a smirk. Yes. There's the traditional human tribal machinations at work. For a moment, I thought you'd managed to grow past them. For some reason, you always give power to the greediest and most corrupt of your kind. I will never understand that. Maybe it was his imminent demise emboldening him, but Samuel couldn't just sit back and accept that insult unanswered. You're one to talk about greed. Dragons are notorious for their hoards. When the dragon stood up to its full height, Samuel feared his brief reprieve was at its end. It reached out its clawed hand and he closed his eyes once again, waiting for the end. However, a moment later, Samuel fell flat on his face. Realizing the dragon must have cut the bonds holding him to the stake, Samuel looked up in time to see the dragon retreating into its cave. It spoke to him over its shoulder. Come with me. There's something I'd like to show you. Samuel watched the dragon walk into its lair, then looked back over his shoulder toward the village. He could just leave, but would the village take him back? He was supposed to be their sacrifice after all. He'd probably just end up tied to the stake again. He could leave and find another village, except he had no idea how to find another village or what to do once he was there. Looking back at the cavern, Samuel felt the pull of curiosity. What in the world did the dragon want to show him? Not to mention, weirdly, he was enjoying talking with the dragon. How many people could claim to have spoken at length with a dragon anyway? Or was it common for dragons to talk with their prey before eating them? Torn between curiosity and self-preservation, Samuel wavered before shrugging and deciding to do as the dragon asked. As he walked into the cavern, Samuel realized the dragon hadn't waited for him and was now some distance ahead, forcing Samuel to break into a light jog. Once he'd caught up, the dragon chuckled again. For a moment there, I was certain you would run away. Samuel shrugged but realized the dragon likely couldn't see it in the dark and instead answered. There didn't seem to be much point. And I don't really have anywhere to go at the moment. The dragon was silent for a moment. Samuel couldn't tell what it was thinking in the dark, but the dragon didn't make him wait long before it started speaking again. Well, I can't find fault in your logic, but still, it takes some courage to walk into a dragon's lair. Doubly so if you know they're awake and aware of your presence. Samuel smiled, just a little, to himself. This was certainly the kind of encounter not many could boast of. Of course, it remained to be seen if he'd live long enough to boast about anything to anyone, but for now, he'd take this experience for what it was worth. However, just as he started to feel rather proud of himself, Samuel stumbled in the dark, nearly falling over. The dragon paused a moment before speaking again. Oh, that's right. Your kind can't see well in the dark, can you? Here, take this. The dragon then handed Samuel something that felt like a stick. Samuel frowned. Just what am I supposed to do with? Before he could finish his question, the tunnel suddenly brightened as a whoosh of flame passed just over his head, lighting up the torch he was holding. After a moment to process what had just happened and how close those flames had come to cooking him alive, Samuel finished his thought with an articulate, "Ugh!" The torch didn't light up the whole cave, but it lit up the nearby wall and floor, making walking more manageable. However, it was also somewhat unnerving looking up and seeing the dragon's long neck fade into shadow until its head was barely visible. They walked on in silence for a bit, giving Samuel's mind time to wander. Was he just delivering the dragon's meal deeper into the cave? If he survived to walk away from this, what would he do? Go back to his old life, making tables and chairs for the very people who'd tied him to a stake and left him to die? What else could he do? What kinds of life existed for a woodworking apprentice who'd never traveled or learned anything else? Maybe if the dragon did eat him, it would be an easier resolution to all of this. It would probably be over pretty quick, and then he'd be, well, maybe not free, but certainly not tied down to this life he'd never asked for. As his thoughts and mood were starting to take a darker turn, the wall to Samuel's right turned off and passed into the darkness, leaving him standing in a small globe of light in a cavern so large he couldn't see any part of it from the radius of his little torch. The dragon looked down at Samuel. Well, congratulations, human. You are officially the first human to enter this space with an invitation. Tell me, what do you think? Samuel held up his little torch to try and get a better look, but still, all he saw was darkness. Well, it certainly seems large. The dragon smirked again. Yes, you limited vision. Just a moment. With that, the dragon walked away, leaving Samuel alone in his little island of light amid the sea of darkness. If the dragon was trying to humble him further, that had certainly been achieved. At that moment, he felt smaller and more insignificant than ever before. This time, the whoosh of flame was a little further off into the cavern, but soon, a stream of fire took off, running around the cavern as a stream of some sort of flammable liquid lit up the cavern in an awe-inspiring display. Samuel turned and watched as the fire made its rounds, lighting up a cavern that could have fit the better part of his village inside. Thankfully, looking around, there didn't seem to be a massive pile of bones or anything like that. Finally, he saw the dragon lying down on a slightly raised slab of stone, resting its head on the ground as it watched him take everything in. Seeing that he was facing it again, the dragon asked, "See anything missing?" Another quick look revealed nothing but a large, empty cavern. Samuel nodded. Yeah, everything. There's nothing here. The dragon raised its head just enough to shake it. That's not true. Look, right over there in the corner. There's my hoard. Go take a look and see what you think. There was indeed a pile of something, some metal as well as something else. Something white. Holding his torch up to dispel the shadows cast by the fire passing around the cavern's edge, Samuel approached the pile, which was significantly larger than it had first appeared. The pile was filled with metal, some silver and gold, but most of it seemed to be iron and steel. Upon closer inspection, it appeared to be a pile of weapons and armor, much of which was melted or shredded in some way. The white bits he'd seen were the remnants of the skeletons of the men and women who'd evidently overestimated their gear's protective ability. Samuel felt as though the odds of his survival were dropping. A blast of air that almost knocked Samuel off his feet announced the dragon's arrival, which landed not far away from him. Those are all that's left of the various adventurers who've come to slay me from my hoard over the years. To be fair, even if it is damaged, all that equipment would probably fetch a tidy sum. So, the more adventurers that come, the bigger my hoard gets. The bigger my hoard gets, the more adventurers that show up. Eventually, it's just easier to pack up and leave. Not that I have anything to pack, but you get the idea. Looking at some of the rings and amulets that adorned the skeletons, Samuel had to agree. There was a small fortune here, though nowhere near enough to tempt him to challenge the dragon off to his side. All the gold and jewels in the world didn't matter if they were only decorating your grave. Samuel shook his head. But why did they seek you out to begin with if there wasn't any treasure here before they brought it? The dragon gave the approximation of a shrug. Haven't you heard? Dragons are notorious for their hoards. Hearing his own words flung back at him, Samuel shook his head. Yeah, sorry about that. I guess I just never thought. When he paused, his thoughts petering into nothing as many of his assumptions fell by the wayside, and the dragon spoke up for him. You never thought of what we'd do with all that treasure if we had it. What use have I for gold or jewels? They have no intrinsic value other than that which you humans give them. You're like a bunch of crows gathering shiny things to fill your nests and help attract a mate, but you don't really understand why. Samuel looked back at the treasures and shook his head. Well, there's more to it than that. I mean, yes, you're right. It's not valuable in and of itself, but it is valuable for what it can do for us. One of those rings could feed me for a month. One of those suits of armor could buy me a nice home. They provide safety and security in a world where those two things are scarce. The dragon settled down onto its elbows again and gave Samuel a look that was hard to interpret. So these baubles have value because of the securities they provide, and they have security because of the value you've given them? That is the most circular thing I've heard all day. But tell me, what of your noblemen? The ones who already live in castles and still possess enough gold and jewels to feed themselves and their families for 100 lifetimes? Why do they still covet more? Samuel scrunched up his face and thought. I don't know. Honestly, I've never had to think of it, and you're right, it doesn't make sense. But then again, I'll never have to worry about such things. A noble's life is as far removed from my own as a dragon's, and right now, I suspect I'm less likely to find a noble willing to sit and chat with me than a dragon. That made the dragon chuckle, which made Samuel grin. The dragon turned its head and examined him momentarily before changing the subject. Well, small human, you've impressed me. Perhaps if I decide not to eat you, you'll go on to do something noteworthy with that short life of yours. Perhaps it'll be noteworthy enough to attract the attention of one of those nobles. Then maybe you'll get a chance to ask them. Samuel chuckled to himself at the thought, and then he stopped and looked up at the dragon. Wait, you said I impressed you? What did I do? The dragon shook its head. That. Of all the things I mentioned just now, it was the fact that you've impressed me you focused on, rather than whether or not I'll eat you. Samuel shrugged. Well, it seems to me that if you're going to eat me, there's not a whole lot I can do about it at this point. Sure, I'll probably try and fight back at that moment, but I expect that to be about as effective as if an ant tried to face me in combat. So why worry about something I can't do anything about? On the other hand, how many humans have ever impressed a dragon? That's far more interesting. The dragon lowered its head and extended its neck until its face was mere inches from Samuel's. Despite his brave words a moment ago, he couldn't help but wonder if these were his final moments. However, after a minute, the dragon withdrew before speaking. What is your name, little man? Surprised by the question, it took Samuel a moment to answer. I'm Samuel. The dragon nodded in acknowledgement. Greetings, Samuel. You may call me Thalessa. Samuel tilted his head. Well, surprisingly, it's been a pleasure to meet you, Thalessa. But I thought you said you had no name I could pronounce. The dragon, Thalessa, shrugged again. Well, you can't pronounce my real name. However, this is not my first time dealing with humans. That's the name they gave me in the past, and I find it serviceable enough. Then, standing as if to leave, the dragon turned back to Samuel. So what now, young Samuel? What will you do after having survived a close encounter with a dragon? Samuel stopped and thought about it again, but nothing new came to mind. Well, I don't know. I don't have many options, I'm afraid. I don't have the supplies or knowledge to travel, and I don't have the skills to do anything but work with wood. I guess I'll go back and keep living the same life I lived before today. It's kind of amazing. The world seems so different now, and yet my life will stay the same. I wonder if I'll be able to find the same satisfaction I used to have in my work, or if I've been cursed to want more than that small life from now on. Thalessa eyed him for a moment. And if you could travel? What would you do then? Samuel laughed and shook his head. Well, again, I don't know, but it sure would be interesting to find out as I went. Maybe one day, if I were lucky enough to live long enough, I'd come back to tell you about my travels and what I've seen. I don't think anyone else in the village would care about my stories. Thalessa nodded toward the pile of loot. Then take what you need and don't be stingy. Like I said, I've got no use for the stuff. Samuel looked at the pile of gear, then back to the dragon. Are you sure? This time, the dragon laughed. I already told you, I don't have any use for the stuff, nor do I value it the way you humans do. But if you like, we can consider it a loan. For payment, you'll have to return and regale me with your stories, just as you said. Samuel smiled. It's a deal. Samuel looked out over the valley. It seemed like years since he last looked over the village below. Of course, that's because it had been. No one in the village he'd grown up in had even recognized him. Then again, they probably assumed he was long dead in the belly of a dragon. The climb up the mountain that towered over the village had been longer and harsher than he remembered before. Most of his hair had turned gray, but somehow, the cavern at the top seemed a bit smaller and lonelier. However, as he approached the cavern, a low, deep rumble shook him to the core in a way that had been etched deep into his memories. Little human, what are you doing here? Samuel answered with a smile born of confidence gained from countless experiences, the likes of which he could never have dreamed when he'd last heard those words. I've come to fill a promise to an old friend. A moment later, a familiar form that had graced him countless times in his dreams, when times had been rough or dangerous, crawled out of the cavern. The great dragon, Thalessa, looked him up and down. She paused momentarily before answering. Well then, young Samuel, welcome back. I've been waiting.